has taught at Gurion University and Sapir College on ethnic relations, land planning, and regional development. And prior to his current role, which is with the Abraham Initiatives, Dr. Abu Rass served on the board of directors of Adalah and as the director of its Negev office. And then following that, after 6 years on the international board of the Abraham Initiatives, he joined as co-CEO in 2014, where he currently serves today. He is also a husband and has 2 children. Thank you so much, Dr. Abu Rass, for joining us today. We're really appreciative. Thank you. Also with us today is Dr. Dan Aviv, who has been engaged with Jewish learning for over 30 years as an educator, an innovator, a professor, published scholar, and author. He has 3 kids, 2 books, and a podcast. And in addition to advancing Israel education with the New Israel Fund of Canada, he serves as founder and principal at Adrabah, which is a Jewish high school in Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Aviv.
Thank you.
So maybe we'll just jump right into our questions. We've got a few for, again, our panelists today, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A from our participants. So to start us off, the first question that we had is for Dr. Abu Rass and Dr. Aviv. What's important to you when you talk about what happened in 1948? And maybe we'll start with Dr. Abu Rass.
Yeah, first of all, hello everybody. I'm happy for the opportunity to talk with you. I'm sorry that we are making this discussion while we see the war in Ukraine. I think we all have to raise our voice to stop this war, this nasty war, but in the same time to learn from this war. There are some similarities and dissimilarities of what's going on there. After all, it's a conflict between 2 countries. This is what I wanted to start with. And I would like to say that the Nakba, the 1948 events, it's a crossroad for my people, the Palestinians. It's a crossroad for me as for my family. So I would like to start by telling you my personal story. Maybe my personal story may shed some lights on the plight of the Palestinian indigenous people and their reality and their life. I live in Kalansawa. Kalansawa is 35 miles northeast of Tel Aviv in the center of Israel. And my dad got married with my mom in 1944, just 4 years before the Nakba. 4 years before the proclamation of Israel. And my mom is from Heribia. Heribia is a southern Palestinian village, used to be exactly in the border with Gaza. For you who knows Israel very well, it's south of Ashkelon, okay? So my dad got married in 1944. She moved to live with him from the south to the north. After 4 years, in 1948, my mom's family expelled and became refugees, uprooted from their own Heribia village, Palestinian village, and became refugees. Now half of my family, all my family from my mom's side, is living in the refugee camps of Gaza. I have very strong connection with the people of Gaza. It's a blood relation, actually. And just for you to know that I'm visiting the ruins of my mom's village. Today, there are 2 different kibbutzim for the Shomer HaTzair leftist movement that really established there. It's Karmia and Zikim. It's exactly in the coastal area. It's the south foremost coast of Israel today. So I'm meeting people there, Jewish people who live in the kibbutzim. I have a dialogue with them, talking with them, and I'm asking them how you see the solution. And until now, there are some remnants of the village. There is a school where my mom went to school for the first grade. This school became right now the offices of the kibbutz of Karmia, and there are other remnants that really obvious Palestinian remnants there. So I would like to stop here and say that for me, the Nakba, it's the split, the moment in history where my people just shattered everywhere, and it's affecting us. And it's about time that Jews should learn about the Nakba and learn more about it. And I'm happy that more and more Jewish people around the world trying to understand, including you, what happened during the Nakba. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Abu Rass, for sharing that very personal story and your own connection to the events of 48. Maybe we'll turn now to Dr. Aviv. What's important to you when you talk about what happened in 48?
Well, most of the people I talk to about what happened in 48 are Jews. So it's like a very within the family kind of conversation. And I think the most important thing to emphasize there is that what happened in 1948 is not a Marvel movie with heroes and villains in a messy third act. I mean, it's not what happened in No Jerusalem, and it's not what happened in Exodus, the novels that kind of make their way, they get passed from hand to hand on birthright trips. And it's not a neatly packaged narrative. And I think that's, the most important thing, because a lot of the education that's happened and continues to happen tries to, not oversimplify, but sort of create this very pat narrative. We're seeing it play out in the Ukraine as well. And so if I bring anything to the conversation, I want to bring a little complexity. I want to focus on what doesn't get talked about or not talked about enough. And inevitably it becomes, I guess, a story that people who heard the story already don't want to hear. And it creates a lot of bad feeling, I guess. It's like, well, they say, don't ever meet your heroes. So that's kind of what happens when, when I talk about what happened in 1948.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for those. Thank you for your thoughts on that. And so maybe we'll turn to you again and ask, then how do we understand what happened, or excuse me, how do we understand what led up to 1948? How can we understand the lead up to it?
Yeah, the lead up to it, actually, it started with the establishment, the foundation of Zionist movement, and the discussion within the Zionist movement were to establish the Jewish state. And hopefully you know that dozens of places around the world really designated or suggested to be to establish the Jewish state. And I know the heated debate within the Zionist movement, but it's very important to know there is a strong connection with Jewish religious people, with Palestine, with Eretz Israel. It used to be for decades. We know this reality, and Jews lived with Arabs, with Palestinians for centuries here, not decades, sorry, centuries. But with the emergence of the Zionist movement and the encouraging the people to move to Palestine, the Zionist movement used a false narrative, okay, telling the people that we are going to a land for people, to people. It's actually designated to people without land, for a land without people, that it's a barren area, nobody is there. And this is part of the Zionist narrative. Also, where there's a lot of songs until now that the square of Jerusalem is empty, like no people. Palestinians became a kind of invisible. Denial of the existence of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are nomads, not tied to the ground, an empty land. And the Palestinians are part of the Arab people who have so much land all over. I can really discuss with you every single false item of those. Just to tell you that the Bedouins of the Negev, the Palestinians never nomads in this area. This is the Holy Land. It's inhabited area for centuries. So I believe everything started with Balfour Declaration in 2017, exactly when the British moved to occupied Palestine. The British, actually, it's a colonial power, gives to another people, another group, the Jewish people, a gift, which is a homeland at the expense of another people, which is the Palestinian. This is what happened. And I would like just to read the Balfour Declaration for you, just to understand how the language, the terminology they used, okay? His Majesty's government viewed in favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jews communities in Palestine. We are talking about 11% of the total population Jews and 89% Palestinians. We're talking about 1917, and still the declaration, Balfour Declaration, talking about Jews and non-Jews, okay? Like Palestinians are invisible there. So I believe this is the treatment of the locals as invisible, as non-Jews, not as indigenous people. Everything that happened in 1948 really started with this declaration. I believe that also, just to know that Jews started to immigrate to Palestine, and for many Palestinians, it's kind of a threat for them. They started to buy land, but up to 1948, up to the Nakba, Jews controlled only 6% of the total geographical area of Palestine. And in 1948, in the eve of the Nakba, 1/3 of the population were Jews, 2/3 are Palestinians. I would like to stop here. I can keep talking, so maybe I can continue by answering questions.
Yeah, it's all good. Thank you, Dr. Abu Rass, for thank you. We really appreciate your thoughts on that question. Maybe we'll now turn to Dr. Aviv. How do we understand what led up to 1948?
Well, it's an interesting irony here because, you know, the short answer is perfidious Albion, you know, like the British, you know, made this mess. So on the one hand, you know, the Zionist project was a colonial project, but on the other hand, the situation that arose in Palestine was a result of the classic colonialist move of, you know, divide et impera, you know, divide and conquer. You pit people against each other, and then you sit back and let them, you know, be distracted by squabbling and fighting, and then the colonial, you know, overlord kind of sits back and you know, doesn't have to actually govern with an iron fist. And it's as old as the hills, right? Like the Romans did it, you know, back in the day. So, you know, what led up to 1948? It's basically as Dr. Abu Rass said, you know, there was like two colonial projects at work here. And sometimes they worked in concert, and sometimes they were against each other, and to the point where the British kind of threw up their hands and said, this is not working for us anymore, we're out, leaving the one colonial project in place, which was the Zionist colonial project, in an attempt to sort of, you know, change the fate, the nature and face of Palestine and mandatory Palestine into what will become the state of Israel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that insight and for that analysis of the events that led up to it. And so maybe now we'll turn very specifically to 1948. Dr. Aviv, do you want to walk us through how you would describe the events of 1948?
Well, I mean, I'll talk about it really. I mean, you know, Dr. Abu Rass talked about the Balfour Declaration as kind of setting the stage, but if you really want to talk about, you know, the beginning of the war and the conflict and the Nakba, I would start it on 29 November 1947. where the UN General Assembly in Lake Success, New York, approved a partition resolution by a vote of 33-13 with 10 abstentions. And this kind of set the plan in place that ultimately Palestine would be divided in between Jews and Palestinian Arabs living in the land. And at that point already, violence broke out pretty much across all of British Mandatory Palestine. And at this point, I would say it was a civil war. And civil wars are never pretty. No state is born, shiny and beautiful and clean. And so from November 29, 1947 to, I would say, 13 or 14 May 1948, it was a very ugly civil war between militia groups, between armed Jewish groups and armed Palestinian Arab groups, sort of, attacking each other across the country, along roads, etc. And then once Ben Gurion declared the state of Israel on May 14th in Tel Aviv in the Art Museum, the war became an international conflict between sovereign states, I guess. The only sovereign state not being a sovereign state were the Palestinians. They didn't have an opportunity to declare themselves a state. And then when the dust settled in, I would say, March of 1949, and you look at the maps of the armistice lines, there are, old entities and new entities, but of the two entities that were supposed to come into existence as a result of the UN resolution, only one succeeded in doing that, to the detriment and loss of the other. So, I mean, in brief, shorthand, that's how I would describe those events.
Thank you. Dr. Abu Rass, how would you describe the events of 1948?
Well, the Palestinian Arabs really rejected the partition plan, officially rejected the partition plan. From their point of view, I have, let's say, a house of 5 different rooms. All of a sudden, the international community, the British, are suggesting to give the Jews 3 rooms and to leave for the indigenous people 2 rooms. It was unfair, actually, deal. Just remind you of the figures. Palestinians making up 2/3 of the population, Jews 1/3. We're talking in 1947. Palestinians are controlling overwhelming majority of the land, over 90%, the Jews controlling 6% of the land, yet the international community is dividing Palestine, giving the fertile land for the Jews, giving more land for the Jews. And honestly, the Palestinians rejected the partition plan. Now, the Jewish Zionist movement, Ben Gurion, really said yes to the partition plan, but with big but, say it's not enough. Why he said it's not enough? Well, if you go and Google the Jewish state 1947, you will find that within the Jewish state that geographically is making up 56% of the total territory of the homeland, Palestine, between the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean, the Jewish state should consist 48% of Palestinians within the Jewish state. You cannot really establish a Jewish state with 48% Palestinians. Okay, so Ben Gurion knew that it's not gonna work, but politically he said yes. And then, honestly, 1948, for the Jewish people, it's a fight for survival following the Holocaust. Remind you that the end of 1948, it was just 3 years before, 1945, okay? It's a fight for survival after the Holocaust. So the more organized, I will say Zionist, the more experienced and educated leaders, and also financially and politically supported around the world. Europe wanted to get out of the Jews, okay? And there is a lot of sympathy, okay, after the Holocaust, and they found the place in Palestine. So they supported Soviet Union, the British Empire, the United States, all really voted in favor of the establishment of Israel, all it was in favor, were in favor of the partition plan. So I believe that this is exactly what happened. The stronger, the more supported, the more educated Zionists who fought, and they are very more motivated than the Palestinians, and also saw this war as this fight as a fight of survival. They cannot lose the war, and they won the war, and this is what happened in 1948.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abu Rass. And I think one of the things that you point to very clearly is this idea that it was a fight for survival. Or at least it was felt that way among the Jewish population at the time. And that really points to our next question, which is that certainly, and I guess at some level, it's a question of sort of multiple understandings or narratives. So certainly 1948 was a disaster for Palestinians, many of whom became refugees at that time. But for many sort of new Israelis, Israel being founded at that time, 1948 was a cause for celebration. And so how might we understand these two experiences together?
Well, listen, no doubt there is a slogan in Arabic. In Arabic, it's like this: "يوم استقلالكم هو يوم نكبتنا." Your Independence Day is our disaster day. This is the well famous, and the Palestinians are actually, while Jews in Israel really celebrating and cheering the Independence Day, Palestinians mourning this day, and they are going to visit the so-called the destroyed villages within Israel. And this thing has been bringing some tension sometimes. From the point of view for Palestinian, what's important for them now to recognize the Nakba. Israelis should recognize the Nakba, should study the Nakba, and also should share the land. And this is the best solution. Palestinians said, well, if the Jews didn't forget that Eretz Israel, Hashana Bab, Yerushalayim Habnuya, 2,000 years, for 2,000 years, they didn't forget this homeland. How come? Can they imagine that Palestinians can forget their homeland after 74 years? Okay, I would like to refer to you to what Peter Barnett just published an article in New York Times last year, 10 months ago. Okay, I would like just to, from here, just to cite what he wrote. Establishment Jewish leaders denounce the fact that Palestinians pass down their identity as refugees to their children and grandchildren. But Jews have passed down our identity as refugees for 2,000 years. In our holidays and liturgy, we continue mourn our expulsion and express our yearning for return after being forcibly exiled from their land. Proclaims Israel's declaration of independence. The people kept faith with its throughout their dispersion. If keeping faith that exile can be overcome is sacred to Jews, how can we condemn Palestinians for doing the same thing? So I believe that most people have their own narratives, and we have to respect those narratives for both people, and we should treat the narratives equally. This is the only way that really can, if we look respectfully to each other narrative, this can really open a window or a door for possible solution in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Abu Rass, for your thoughts. Dr. Aviv, how might we hold these two experiences together?
Well, I mean, I looked at the way my family holds these experiences and how they process what happened in 1948. So I was actually speaking to my mom yesterday, and she said, "Well, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "I'm on this panel. We're talking about the Nakba." And she's like, "Well, what's that?" And the thing is that she's 80. She was born in Palestine. She was a child when the War of Independence happened, and she was not familiar with the term. And I think that's kind of says a lot right there. And Dr. Abu Rass was mentioning that I think it's really important that we sort of acknowledge the events and what went on, and the fact that the day of celebration for some is a day of mourning for others. And I think that if you go one generation back, so to my mother's parents, there's a very indicative story there too, if I can indulge in a little family history. So my grandfather was a socialist. He went through Hachshara in Rakishok, Lithuania, fully intending to come to Palestine and come and be on a kibbutz, building the land as he was going to be, rebuilt by it. And when he arrived in Palestine, he was told by his handlers, I guess, in the Jewish agency, like, look, the British are opening up spots in the police force, and and Palestinian Arabs are joining. We need Jews in there too, so you have to go and be a cop. So he went and joined the police force, and in fact, I have his. Can you see that? Palestine Police, right? Like I have his epaulets, whatever. And the thing is that he, when he served in a unit where it was like the British were in command, and there were Palestinian Arabs and Jews together. And when he was in police academy, like I guess it was near a nursing school, and he met this young woman who ended up becoming his wife. Her family were dyed-in-the-wool revisionists. Like her brother was, shall we say, regarded as a terrorist by the British. And in fact, every time that my grandfather would go over to my grandmother's family to visit, her brother would have to leave the house because he would have to arrest him if they were in the same room together. So when it came to the question of what happened in 1948, my grandmother, was very quick with the triumphalist narrative. It was, the few against the many, and they rejected the partition, and they left us no choice, etc. But my grandfather had a different story, and because he was, they were in Tiberias at the time, and one of the things that he had to do, one of the jobs or the roles he served in the police was to go into Palestinian villages to prevent looting. And I asked him, well, what did you see there? And he said, well, in some of the houses, many of the houses, I saw food still on the table. I'm like, well, how do you understand what that means? As well, either they ran away or they were chased away. You don't leave food on the table. And so I said, well, so, what happened in 1948, right, with the Palestinians? What did we do to them? And he said, well, some of them ran away because, no one wants to be around for a war. And for a lot, and some of them, as he said with a wave of his hand, silaknu otam, we chased them away. We got rid of them. And that was kind of like part of the family history, that this is what happened. And we didn't have any kind of illusions what he meant when he said silaknu otam. Like, I don't know if he himself was responsible as a police officer, but he spoke in the plural, like he may not have done it himself personally, but it was something that was done in his name. And so it's been a very complicated way to process this experience, but it definitely, wasn't like, yay, we win, and that was the end of it.
Yes, thank you. And thank you also for sharing that deeply personal family story. And yeah, thank you. So now we turn to the present, and we ask, with all of the understanding that we have and have shared and have learned and have discovered here today, how do we understand the conflict today through what happened in 48? How can we use 1948 as a lens, excuse me, to understand the present conflict? And maybe Dr. Abu Rass will start with you.
Yeah, well, many Palestinians believe that the Nakba began even before 1948 and continues to this day. Actually, the Nakba is never over. Just look to what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Look to what's going on in the Negev, in Area C of the West Bank, expansion of settlements, Judaizing the state. Judaizing the state meaning making the state of Israel is more Jewish, okay, on the expense of its democratic values. And this is affecting us. The nation state law that enacted just 3.5 years also affecting us. It's our status, downgrading the Arabic language. And it seems to us that there is all the time expansion of the Jewishness of the state on the expense of the Arab minority. And that the conflict is, even Israel is controlling the whole territory between the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean. Today, there is a Palestinian Authority, but it's not effective at all. Due to a Gaza Strip, we know that there is a siege there, but Israel can do what all it wants if they want it to, just to expansion of settlements. And we heard about the deal of the century under Trump and so forth. There is a lot of plans that affecting our life. Honestly, we are not happy with what's going on right now. It's about time, okay, that to comprehend, to understand that this land for both people, for Palestinians, for Jews, and we can find the way to live in peace, to live together. We have to share the land. Honestly, I have my own way. Today, I'm not talking about two states, period. No, we are here and they are there. I live inside Israel. I am Israeli citizen. I'm a Palestinian citizen of the state of Israel. Should I be here or there? No, I am here and there, okay? Just like many Jews who live even in New York and feel they are there and here, which is fine. The question, where is Israel? Where is the border of Israel? Israel is a country without a border, and we don't have a lot of sovereign states with not a clear border. Honestly, I am calling to learn and know us, know the Palestinians, know our language, especially our culture. If you know us, you understand that actually we are not different people. We both love this homeland. This land is meaning a lot for us, and we should compromise and find a way to live together. There is a place for two sovereign and independent states with a free movement, maybe a confederation, maybe we have to find a way. But what's going on right now in the ground, it's actually reducing our geographical space, the Palestinians. It's not solving the major problem, which is the issue of refugees, the settlement, Jewish settlement, that all of the time expansion, and also the Jerusalem, the issue of Jerusalem. Honestly, maybe I can end by saying, just think about it in very wise way. Prime Minister of Israel, Bennett, today is shuttling diplomacy, trying to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. And they're talking about end of the occupation of Russia. Yes, we have to end not only the occupation of Ukraine, we have to end the occupation of all countries, including Israel. And this is the moral position that everybody should really adopt today.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Rass, for those very powerful words and for those clear clarion calls. Dr. Aviv, your thoughts? How do we understand the conflict today through 48?
The only thing I want to add to Dr. Abu Rass's comments is that, Jews are no different in the sense that we learn nothing from history. If you go back to the first and second Jewish commonwealths in the land of Israel, those didn't turn out very well because they got too caught up in their own power and in their, imperial designs and imperial games they were willing to play. I'm not trying to sit here and say that, what happened to the Hasmoneans is going to happen again today. But the fact is, Israel today is strong and the Palestinians are weak. and the Arab world is distracted for various reasons or apathetic. And there's sort of this assumption that this will be a permanent arrangement, that this is always going to be like this. And the reality is that, if we learn nothing from history, nothing is permanent. No empire lasts forever. The strong are not always strong. And, I understand that, like, I think it was something like in 2012, Israel, they bottled their first bottles of whiskey because it takes too long, to make whiskey. It takes 10 years, right? So in Israel, it's like, who can think 10 years ahead? But the fact is that I think that, on top of everything else, if we care about Israel as a state and surviving as a state, it needs to look 10 years ahead and understand that like this occupation cannot continue. It just can't. And whether we can get to 2 states or we're already living under 1 state, that's for greater minds to figure out than mine. But I think that the assumption, the hubris that exists currently, that has to stop immediately.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you also for your thoughts on that question. So maybe we'll take just a minute, just a few breaths. I think that you both have given us a ton to think about and really to process and sit with. So we'll take a few breaths. I'll see in the document I have here what questions attendees may have had for the two of you. I'll just review them quickly and we'll come back for some Q&A. Okay, maybe we'll start bringing folks back. I see now that it's 1:04 in Toronto, and we are hoping to close today by 1:15. So we'll take a few minutes for some Q&A, and then we'll do a very brief wrap up and make sure that folks are out by 1:15. So I should say before I get started that folks can also feel free to raise their hands if they have questions and we can call on them. But the first question that we have is an anonymous one, which I will share. And the question is, so it's a question pertaining to 48. What was the context of neighboring countries joining the fray of 1948? For example, Jordan and Lebanon. If we understand that as an international conflict at that moment, then how does that challenge the thinking of what was happening in 48 as a civil war between Jews and Palestinians? Is it still a civil war, or is it something different? And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Aviv.
Well, I mean, if you actually look at what was going on the ground between the partition resolution being approved and Ben Gurion's declaration, most of the forces that were involved in fighting were local militias. But we also know from declassified documents that the Jordanians were not exactly happy with the idea of the creation of a Palestinian state, so near to their borders. So there were informal agreements between Adalah and the Jewish agency, the Yishuv, to sort of not work together or in concert, but to thwart or frustrate any possible Palestinian state that would rise as a result of the partition plan. And we saw that after the Nakba and after the war ended and the armistice was signed, that the Jordanians were only too happy to try to annex the West Bank. This annexation was not recognized by any international body. I think only the British and the Pakistanis acknowledged that annexation attempt. But they did their darndest to sort of not necessarily to integrate the West Bank into Jordan, but to create the conditions where it would be effectively part of Jordan. If you went to high school in anywhere in the West Bank up until the 1967, the curriculum you were learning was a Jordanian curriculum from the ministry in Amman. The currency you were using was Jordanian money. So, at least they had more open interest about what their designs were after 1948. And I could go on, but I think that's enough for now.
Dr.
Abu Rass, was there something that you wanted to? Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, it's worth to mention that, just to add that when we talk the Arab countries, really there are 6 army units that came from 6 different Arab countries, including Iraq, even Maghreb, Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, did engage in the war of 1948. But it's worth to mention that all those armies, units, including the Palestinian, still less in numbers, less than the Jewish army in 1948 in terms of numbers. So when we talk Arab armies really invaded Israel, it's not true that Arab armies. There are units that really supported the Palestinian. They came to support following the fragmentation within the Palestinian society. There is 2 major families, Nashashibi and Husseini, and also the Arab countries really took control of the Palestinian issue even before 1948. Hajj Amin al-Husseini had a lot of fights of Arab regimes. And all in all, just to mention that the major units that came from outside of Palestine came from Jordan, and I agree with Dan Aviv regarding his explanation. But let's remember also the commander of the Jordanian army actually was a British officer. Just to see where Britain, the colonial power of Britain, really work inside Israel, outside Israel, supporting Israel with the Jordanian. It's something really. It was a mess. I believe again the Palestinians made a mistake. They didn't really calculate their position. They didn't understand that Europe, after the Holocaust, wanted to find a solution for the Jewish people, and they found it in Palestine. And they didn't have this calculation, and they made the mistakes. And the results, the outcomes, we know what happened in 1948, the Nakba.
Many thanks to you both for your comments on that question. We have a question specifically for Dr. Aviv. This is from Rachel. Rachel, if you don't mind, I'll offer it on your behalf. As an educator, what has the process been like trying to integrate Nakba education into education in the Jewish community?
You hear that heavy sigh? The fact is, what's the process like? Is there a process? I don't think there's a process. I think that is really where, like, one of the last holdouts of the traditional narrative and the Hasbara narrative, is being promulgated, and each of the day schools are kind of trying to out-Zionist each other in terms of how pro-Israel they are, and again, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I think the education And you bring in the Shinshinim and the Shinshinim program, which I don't know if you guys are all familiar with, where they bring these young Israelis over here to Toronto to go into the schools and bring a taste of Israel to the kids. And it's shall we say it's lacking. It's lacking in substance, and it's lacking in kind of acknowledging the reality on the ground for millions of people in Israel, Palestine. I don't think you're going, I mean, you may hear the word Nakba mentioned in some schools. I don't think it's given the attention that it deserves. I was in one setting, which will remain nameless, that I was told, well, we talk about Deir Yassin, like what more do you want to talk about? Like, I'm like, well, talking about one incident that happened in the context of this war as being somehow representative of this whole process is kind of, oversimplifying, just paying short shrift to something that's a lot more complicated and has bearing and impact to today. But I think the bottom line is, I think it's perceived as a zero-sum game, that somehow if there's any acknowledgement in the context of talking about, the War of Independence, that A, Israelis did anything wrong, or B, that the Palestinians have any merit to anything they say, is somehow like it's somehow detracting or ruining this the narrative of the miraculous event, right? It's like with Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof. You start pulling on that one thread, and where does it, where has it led, right? So.
It sounds like it has been quite painful and quite challenging. Thank you so much, Dr. Aviv. And so I think we have time for one more question. I'm seeing that we're running up just close to the quarter of the hour. And this question is for Dr. Abu Rass. And I do want to, it's from, it's an anonymous question, but I do want to offer that the person who asked this question is really asking this from a place of love and a place of trust. So they really, their heart's in the right place, and but they do observe, and their question is that sometimes as Jews we confront within the Palestinian solidarity movement anti-Semitism, and how do we cope with that? What do we do with that?
Well, no doubt there are some crazy Palestinians. Nobody has really the monopoly in craziness or stupidity. We have our own stupid people. Okay, let us acknowledge that. And but I believe the best way to deal with these issues, not to ignore them, but to try to tackle, to talk with these people, explain things. I believe Palestinians in large will understand very soon if you just acknowledge their rights, their history, the Nakba, what happened. Those people are really, I believe there are some hatred for Jews. Unfortunately, I'm saying that among our people. I hate to say that, but this is truth, okay? So as long as we are not trying to gear toward a solution, acknowledgement, to share this land, okay, to try to build a shared future for Jews and Palestinians in this homeland, okay? This phenomena of anti-Semitism, here and there, you can find it, but I have to acknowledge also that the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians really understand it's a conflict over land and can be solved. From the point of view of Palestinians, that Israelis, the Israeli leadership, that really not interested for now to solve this problem.
Thank you so much for those really, really important reminders and that really thoughtful and sage advice. And I now see that we are at 1:15, and so I just want to wrap up today's presentation and speakers and Jamboard by saying thank you so much, both to Dr. Abu Rass and to Dr. Aviv for joining us. Thank you so much for your thoughtful, sage wisdom, and also your clarity, your analysis, and the understanding that you've really brought to our hearts and minds today. I want to also thank Alex for facilitating the Jamboard session beforehand, and to the entire NIFC, New Generations Council, and of course to our staff member who works with and beside us day in, day out, Hannah Cohen. Thank you so much. Thank you. And in particular, the last thing I'll say is I want to thank everyone who came today. Thank you so much for attending and for really being present with open hearts and open minds.
תודה רבה, שוכרן ג'זילן, בואו לבקר את ההומלנד, the shared homeland. בואו לבקר.
Thank
you.
תודה.